Surprise, motherfuckers. It's the Conor McGregor's left hand of MMA podcasting, Jack Slack, here to find the chin of your ear with a extra Friday episode because I felt like it. I'm at a loose end, and I got so many questions last week in the emails that I thought I might actually go ahead and answer a few more in this episode. Quick touch on what's happening at the moment. Holly Holm and Jermaine Durandamy have just come in on weight. Significantly underweight. Durandamy is 1.5 pounds under. As someone pointed out on, I think it was Reddit, people don't cut extra weight for fun. So the idea that this featherweight division was desperately needed is still a little bit, But they both looked in great shape, so, anything that's anything that incentivizes not dehydrating yourself into a raisin before you get punched in the head for 3 to 5 rounds, I'm in favour of. Then what else is new? MVP versus Paul Daly fell through. Surprise, surprise. In favour of a really good matchup at Bellator's next London event, Rory McDonald versus Paul Daly, which is better than the last 2 headliners that the UFC's done there. So that's fantastic. I will actually buy tickets to that. I'd get a press pass, but I think I'd just end up shouting at Scott Coker, making a scene. Other news regarding Coker, he passed on the details of people who insinuated that Sonnen versus Ortiz was a fake fight onto Viacom, hoping that they'll do something about it. As someone who never said that was a fake fight, but who tried to understand why people would think that, my conclusion, you'll remember from the podcast not last week, however many weeks ago, was that fights between 40-year-old wash-ups look weird, especially if they're put on a card full of young talent, and you're used to seeing 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds headline UFC events. The solution to that would be to stop making the old man fights, but I think Scott Coker's hands are tied by Viacom on that, so why not threaten to sue anyone that you don't like? That's how you win goodwill. Right, let's do some questions. Hi Jack, I'm a long-time fan and I've followed your work across 3 different websites because I can't get enough of the brainy way you look at fighting. In a recent podcast, you mentioned how toe kicks have potential in MMA. Do any other unconventional strikes have potential, i.e. ridge hands, hammer fists, palm strikes, knuckle punches? Knuckle punches? Oh, I'm assuming he means like single knuckle punches and things. Karate chops, etc. Would it make a difference if the fighters didn't wear gloves? Cheers, Gary. Oh, I'm madly in love with the half scissor left hook at the moment. I was reading Battling Nelson's book about his boxing career, and he says once he learned this technique, he went from an average fighter to a great fighter. And I'm reading about it, and then I later found Mark Hatmaker, who writes books about MMA and grappling and striking and things, a bit of a historian. Because of the very thin gloves that they wore back in the day, this is Jack Johnson's day, I showed you clips of Jack Johnson grabbing his man's wrists last episode. Because of that, Nelson could actually jam his thumb in under the other guy's ribs, so he'd just find the liver over and over with the thumb. Which reminds me of a seminar I saw with, I think it was Greg Nelson. He was talking about kneeing in the clinch, and he was saying, just here on the inside of the thigh, but make sure you get the same point every time. He said, if I do it with my thumb, it gets old quickly. And the other guy was like, ow. Thumbs can hurt. There was the old Masoyama one of the middle knuckle of the thumb. If you make a fist with your thumb braced on your fist, then you can slam that in behind the ear. Not really going to hold up to much force. If it hits something hard and you miscalculate how much force you want to put into it, that'll break your thumb quite quickly. In fact, the Uechi-ryu style, I think it's called the Boshiken, that's the middle knuckle of the thumb joint, and they drive it straight in. Absolute madness. Another one that you'd take like a lifetime to condition, and then you end up with one massive thumb. You mentioned ridge hands, and I laughed because I had a training partner who always went on about give him a ridge hand to the groin or a ridge hand to the pussy. He'd go, oh, they just come at me, and I'd just drop down to one knee and throw this ridge hand upwards between their legs. And I have seen actual karateka talk about that as like a really legit option. I watched a guy at the JKA All Japan, which is a point fighting tournament. They're very strict on what they score, and he throws an overhand, what's called haito, ridge hand, into the side of the guy's head and slaps him with it. And anyone else, they wouldn't have scored it. But it was a Japanese dude, so they were like, yes, score that. And it's the only time I've ever seen a ridge hand scored in a Shotokan point fighting competition. And I don't think it'll ever be scored again. Palm strikes are significantly underrated in mixed martial arts. If you watch Shinya Aoki, especially, or Sakuraba, both of them, when they're in top position, if the other guy's not opening up, they'll just start slapping the guy right over the eardrum. And that's another one where the targeting makes all the difference. If you're slapping someone in the head or in the neck or something like that, it's not going to bother them that much. But as soon as you go over the ear hole, you're going to make a move. Otherwise, a fight with you could lead to years of tinnitus. Mow. Karate chops is the weird one. I've seen a standing hammer fist knockout, as in coming in the style of the what's called Moashi Shuto Uchi. So outside to inside, as opposed to across your own body and then outwards. Yeah. Now, see, the thing about the karate chop is that it makes sense from a logic standpoint. You're getting more pressure over a smaller area, the blade of your hand, rather than the full front of your fist. It just isn't very practical yet, because you have to swing it out wide, and a lot of the time, guys will do it with their elbow pointing down. So basically, the force that's coming back through your hand is, if you're striking them in the neck or the head, is going to be similar to that of being in an Americana. And anything where your hand is going across your body first, so inside to outside, generally not that useful. I mean, back fists dominate the point fighting scene, but not terrifically useful, because obviously you're putting both hands on one side of your body, and that's not something that you do in any martial art, really. In principle, that is. Though the backhanded jab has always been a big one for boxers, and even Bill Wallace actually did very well with a backhanded jab. He said back fist for point fighting, and then he just turned it into like a back fisty jab for boxing, because you're not allowed to actually back fist in boxing, but you can throw your hand almost backhanded as long as it connects in a jab-like way. As for would it make a difference if fighters didn't wear gloves? Oh god, the other day someone said who would win in MMA if there were no gloves, and I said, the Ottomans, because they'd wrestle people down and they'd hit them with the Ottoman slap if they couldn't. The Ottoman slap was supposedly like if you got knocked off your horse or disarmed or something like that in battle, it was a straight-armed swing at a guy's head, and supposedly you could knock him over even in a helmet. And they used to practice this on marble soaked in something. It was another one of those ones like iron fist practice. You put the liniment on your hand afterwards, and it imbues you with magic powers, but in fact it just makes your hand look fucking grotesque. Because it swells up with tons of fluid and shit to deal with the fact that you hit stuff every day. Oh god, I was really looking forward to Chris Crudelli's documentary on Kung Fu. I don't know if it ever got made actually, but they put out adverts for it. And he goes to see these iron palm guys, and the guy has one hand that's like a catcher's mitt. And it just reminded me of Makiwara training. Lots of guys got way too seriously into that in the 70s and 80s. I've tried it plenty, and especially in Japan, they love to do that after training sessions. They've got, to be fair, much nicer ones, not a rope pad, but like an actual pad. But the idea of Makiwara training is more to root out the areas in your technique where power's being lost. So like if you hit something as resistant as a Makiwara with your wrist bent or your elbow poking out, you're going to feel something in that joint where it's going wrong. But guys took the hand conditioning aspect of it to the next level and just went mental. I remember hearing some guys in South Africa, when they were first introduced to it, would put salt on the bleeding wounds that they made on their fists using Makiwara. But yeah, don't do that, because you're going to have other interests in your life. You're going to want to play guitar or type on a keyboard or hold hands with your wife and actually be able to, without having this grotesque giant hand Which, if you stop hitting stuff for like a month or so, is going to go down again. So, you're not changing yourself into the ultimate weapon by doing it. There is a point where conditioning just doesn't make sense, body conditioning in that way. I said like you'd need like a lifetime of work to get a good toe kick, but there's not a lot of point when you can use the ball of your foot, or if you want to use your thumb knuckle when your fist will work just as well. It's overcomplicating the mechanical bit of striking instead of working out the strategic bit. Far better to learn the actual move in 5 minutes and then spend the rest of your life learning how to set it up and sneak it through, rather than spending years and years trying to get the actual basic technique down and not being able to until you've destroyed your body. Question 2. Hey, Sensei Slack. Loving the podcasts and articles, keep up the great work. My question is about what makes a good, in inverted commas, or quotes, jab. From a technical standpoint, it is seemingly the simplest strike to learn and execute, but it is heralded as the most important punch in all of boxing. So what makes a good jab? How does a fighter learn to manipulate rhythm with the jab? I understand that GSP and Guillermo Rigo are examples of great jabbers and great rhythm manipulators, but how exactly do they train to become like that? Thanks for your time. And that's from Jack also. Yeah, the question of a good jab is a tricky one, because the jab is 100 different things to 100 different people. Muhammad Ali had an incredible jab. George Foreman had an incredible jab, but they did very different things with the jab. Muhammad Ali opened cuts and worked at a terrific rate. He basically backfisted people in the face. He kept his hand open in his glove and just flicked people with the leather. George Foreman had a jab like walking onto a telephone pole, very famously. He could just punch straight through people's heads with it. George Foreman's jab was a hurting jab. Muhammad Ali's jab was a attrition jab. But, George Foreman wasn't knocking people out with one jab, but he could. If you look at the jab of, say, Jim Driscoll and Jimmy Wilde, the old school English boxer is the stepping in jab, or, in the karate style, Kizamazuki, the weight moves with the jab. So you step, and as your foot lands, your hand lands. Champ Thomas, gives a great little drill in his book that I love telling people about. But it's not really a drill, it's just an understanding thing. But if you put your fist on a wall at the full extent of your jab, pick your lead leg up, and that's how much weight should be on the opponent's face when you complete your thudding jab. But equally, that's a lancing, jolting jab. Well, they used to call it the jolt back in the day, or just the lead straight, or the straight left, or whatever. But if you compare that to, say, Sugar Ray Robinson's weight very, very rarely went in with his jab. His jab was a stabbing arm punch. If you watch his fights with guys like Carmen Basilio, Bobo Olsen, people like that, one hand high, circling to his left, and he'll just stab the jab in with his arm, and his feet are doing their own thing at the time. But those are two examples of a jab as an offensive weapon. One of them is, smashing straight into the guy. The other one is flicking at him, picking at him. But the jab can also be a instigator of exchanges. There are guys like Roberto Duran. Roberto Duran had like 4 or 5 different looks that he did off the jab. So he'd flick out his jab, and then he'd slip off to the left immediately after it, without even seeing what was coming back. Or he'd flick out his jab and slip off to the right. And that would set up the counterpunch if the opponent had punched at him after his jab had been retracted, because he'd already be out of the way. Or he'd jab and duck, which is one that is listed in... Can't remember the name of the book, but it's by the US female boxing team head coach. She said the jab and duck is the most useful move you can learn. Because if you're dealing with someone who wants to swing back at you, throwing out that jab and then it's going to obscure their vision briefly, and then your head is going to be way out of the way when they come back with their own offense, if you've been obscuring their vision with your jab. Duran also used to do a lovely one, which is one of my all-time favourite counterpunches. You see James Toney do it a lot, but not so much off the jab. But Duran would jab, so foot goes straight in, pivots around his left foot so that his right foot is going behind his left, which is typically a no-no in things where you can be knocked over. But so he's pivoting round behind his left foot, and his shoulders high in like a stone wall. And if the opponent came back with the right hand, he'd take it on the shoulder as he was turning, plant the right foot in the position that he'd pivoted to, and throw back the right hand. Absolutely cracking counter. Not tremendously useful in kickboxing because the guy will kick your leg as soon as you start pivoting. But I love that counter in boxing. Just absolutely beautiful. But that's how you use the jab to set up further stuff. The old English boxing school was the jab is enough. And then the Americans were like, no, we like two-fisted hitting. We don't need the jab. We can beat the jab. But the jab is important for a reason. It's the longest weapon you have in terms of boxing arsenal. In sports that allow kicking and takedowns and things like that, it's the longest weapon you have while maintaining stability. Your kicking techniques involve being on one leg, so you're not as mobile and stable when you throw them. That's why the boxing arsenal is always going to be important in MMA, in my humble opinion, because you are at the middle point between reach, or rather range, and stability. Elbows, you're stable because you're on both legs, but they're very short. Knees, you're on one leg and they're very short. Kicks, you're on one leg and they're quite long. So if you want to move around a lot and keep control of your weight, and you're worried about the takedowns or you're worried about the kicks or something like that, that's when the boxing game is so important. But yeah, there's 100 different jabs for different strokes for different folks. But the examples that I gave there are probably some of the best to look at. If you want a really thudding jab straight out of your stance, probably Foreman. If you want like a flicking jab straight out of your stance, Robinson. If you want a flicking jab out of no stance, Ali, because he'd move from side to side dancing with his feet level, side skipping, and then he'd be in stance for an instant before he fired the jab out. Flicking the jab to instigate an exchange and counter, or rather using the jab to set traps, Roberto Duran easily. And then of course the thudding body jab to set up everything else. That's Floyd Mayweather's MO. The fight with Diego Corrales is just a clinic in that, but he was doing that into his last fights, the body jab, just as a way to open opponents up. I could wax lyrical about the jab all day, but the best way to learn what you want to do with your jab is to watch what other people do with it and say, well, which of these really suits me best? And obviously the top boxers can do all of it, not to the same degree, but like Miguel Cotto can jab like a normal boxer, or just like a flicking jab, or a jab to set up his combinations. But against Paulie Malignaggi, can't remember. I can't say his name. Sorry, I'm dreadful with names. You know that by now. But in that fight, he's diving in with the full-on jolting lead and smashing Malignaggi's face up. So there's a time and a place for everything, and if you learn to do a few different jabs, it also makes it a lot harder to counter, because you remember Hazlitt said learn 4 good counters to the jab, because it's going to be the punch you're dealing with the most. If you've got a few different jabs, you can fake them in different ways. You can start stepping and people think, oh Jesus, is that big jolting straight? You can show a little shoulder feint if you've been backhanding them with jabs all the way through. Basically, a jab is like a paintbrush. You explore the different strokes you can do with it and muck around with it. Anyway, I reckon that'll do us for today, especially as it's a bonus episode. Got some fights on tomorrow night. I hope it's good. I'm one of those people who's always like, this is not pay-per-view worthy. Not because I have my savvy consumer hat on, but because I am one of those people who's like, oh fuck, I'm going to pay for this anyway. Or, I'm going to watch this anyway. But I think other people shouldn't. Lots of decent fighters on this card, some absolutely bizarre matchmaking. There'll be an upset because it's the UFC. There'll be one upset, I'm sure. But get back here Monday and we'll talk about whatever happened. Cheers. Connor bless.